So here's our next example. Notice that I have already written down our goal form. And I should mention that this is not mathematically correct notation. These number signs here really, but it works fine as a note to ourselves, just to remember what our form ought to be, and that's fine. So notes to ourselves do not need to be in mathematically correct notation, and it's fine if you have that written off to the side. Actually, it's encouraged if you have that written off to the side when you're doing the test. Now, having mentioned that, remember we want to work one column at a time, get the one where we need it, and then get the zeros in that column. So I could turn this 2 into a 1 by multiplying this row by 1/2, and that would work. I would have to deal with some fractions though. And notice I can get the 1 where I need it just by swapping rows 1 and 2. If you can ever get what you need by swapping in this process, that really is the way to go. So, when you do swap, remember you have to swap the entire row. One common careless mistake is to swap only the left side of the row and leave the constants where they are, but you have to swap the entire row. And do make sure you copy things down right, because for some reason with swapping, it is easier, or it's more common to make careless mistakes while swapping. Well, I guess you're not going to make it other kinds of mistakes, really, so there you go. All right, so now I have my 1 where I want it, and I want to get the rest of the column to be as it needs to be, so I need zeros where this 2 and this 5 are. Let's take care of the 2 first. So I need to add a -2. And since it's not allowable to add a -2 to each item, I have to do -2 times a row. I want to do row 1 because that's where the 1 is in this column, plus row 2 because that's where the number I'm trying to turn into a 0 is. And I'm going to store that in row 2. All right, so now recopying row 1 since that's not changing. Then -2 times 1 is -2, plus 2 is 0. -2 times -2 is +4, plus -1 is 3. -2 times 16 is -32, plus 14 is going to be -18. All right. Then the -2 times 13 is -26, plus 11 is -15. And then we just recopy row 3 because that's not changing in this row operation. All right, so now I want to change this 5 into a 0. I can do that by -5 times row 1, because that's where the 1 is in this column, plus row 3, because that's where the number I'm trying to change into a 0 is. And we store that in row 3. So, first I'm going to recopy the first 2 rows. 1, -2, 16, 13. 0, 3, -18, -15. And now, -5 times 1 is -5, plus 5 is 0. -5 times -2 is +10, plus -10 is 0. -5 times 16 is -80, plus 55 is negative 25. Okay. If you need to pull out a calculator for certain of these calculations, that's positively fine. So a lot of them are simple enough to do in your head, but if you're not confident in your arithmetic ability, that's what calculators are for. All right, so negative 5 times 13 is going to be negative 65, plus 15 is negative 50. There we go. All right, so now column 1 is perfect. So we move on. We don't have to work them in order, but it's nice when you do. Column 2, I want to change this 3 into a 1, and I can do that by multiplying by 1/3. So 1/3 times row 2, store that in row 2. And this is going to be nice. Notice that everything in row 2 is divisible by 3, so I won't have to deal with any fractions. So I'm going to recopy row 1 and multiply everything in here by 1/3. So 3 times 1/3 is 1. Negative 18 times 1/3 is negative 6. Negative 15 times 1/3 is negative 5. And then row 3 stays exactly like it is. Okay. So now, I already have a 0 for one of my zeros, so that's nice. I just need to change this negative 2 into a 0. I can accomplish that by 2 times row 2 plus row 1. Now, I'm doing 2 times row 2 because that's where the 1 is, plus row 1 because that's where the number I'm trying to change into a 0 is. And of course, I always store it in the same row that the number that I'm trying to change into a 0 is. Nudge this up to give me a little more. Actually, we might as well push it all the way up. Okay, so now 2 times 0 is 0, plus 1 is 1. 2 times 1 is 2, plus negative 2 is 0. 2 times negative 6 is negative 12, plus 16 is 4. 2 times negative 5 is negative 10, plus 13 is 3. And then I can recopy my other 2 rows. Okay, so now I have my first 2 columns perfect. So I'll move on to the third column. I want to get the 1 in the correct position, which is where this negative 25 is. So in order to change negative 25 into a 1, and in particular, in order to do that without compromising these other zeros, notice at this point, if I add a row to row 3, I will be losing zeros because I'll get adding 1 to them. So the best way to change that negative 25 into a 1 is to multiply by negative 1/25. You can always get to a 1 by multiplying by the reciprocal. Or I should say that works for any number but 0 because 0 doesn't have a reciprocal. Alright, so that means the first 2 rows are going to stay the same. So I'll just recopy them really quick. And The zeros, since it's multiplication, those are going to stay as zeros. Negative 1/25 times negative 25 is 1. Of course, that's why we chose this. And then negative 1/25 times negative 50 is 2. All right, so now I just have two numbers to change into zeros. Let's go ahead and do the negative 6 first. So in order to change this negative 6 into a 0, I'll need to add 6 to it. So 6 times row 3, because that's where the 1 is, plus row 2, and I'll store that in row 2. Alright, so row 1 isn't changing. I'll just recopy that. Then, notice that every time I start with a 0, 6 times 0 is 0, and when I add in 0, that's not going to change. So these first two places aren't going to change. Then 6 times 1 is 6 plus negative 6 is 0. 6 times 2 is 12 plus negative 5 is 7. And then, of course, row 3 doesn't change. All right, finally, whoops, nudge up just a little bit more, and I need to change this 4 into a 0, so I'll do negative 4 times row 3 plus row 1, store that in row 1, and the first two places aren't going to change again because these are zeros here. Negative 4 times 1 is negative 4 plus 4 is 0. Negative 4 times 2 is negative 8 plus 3 is negative 5. And then my other two rows don't change. And there we have it. Now this is in our form that tells us the answer. So this system does have a single solution, and it is the point -5, 7, 2.